Franklin Moss's voice cut through the community room like a blade meant to draw blood. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stop right there." The old man at the microphone froze, his weathered hand still raised in a gesture of patience. Moss continued, his tone theatrical enough to ensure every veteran in the room heard his contempt. "We have had enough people today claiming extraordinary service to justify extraordinary benefits." What Franklin Moss did not know, what no one in that fluorescent-lit room yet understood, was that in exactly 11 minutes, he would be on his knees begging this homeless man for forgiveness. The VA regional office community room smelled of industrial cleaner and decades of disappointment. Fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, some flickering with the irregular rhythm of a dying heartbeat. Rows of plastic chairs filled the space, half occupied by veterans of various ages who had waited hours for their chance to speak. The elevated table at the front held 3 administrators with microphones, but only one of them mattered. Franklin Moss, Deputy Regional Director, sat in the center position like a king holding court over subjects he found distasteful. Elias Crane had waited 4 hours for this moment. For hours in a plastic chair that dug into his spine. For hours watching other veterans approach the microphone with their paperwork and their pain, only to be dismissed with bureaucratic indifference. He had not complained. He had not shifted or sighed or checked a watch he no longer owned. He had simply waited with the patience of a man who had once spent 9 hours crawling through a burning city to save men who could not save themselves. His appearance invited judgment. The khaki pants hung 3 sizes too large on his frame, cinched with a length of rope at the waist. The olive-drab t-shirt had faded to the color of dust. His boots, military issue from another lifetime, were held together with electrical tape wrapped so precisely it looked almost intentional. His hair had gone white and wild, and a beard covered the lower half of a face marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. But his hands, weathered and scarred as they were, moved with a precision that seemed out of place. When he reached for the glass of water on the table beside the microphone, his fingers wrapped around it with the economy of motion that comes from decades of training. Moss leaned forward into his microphone, feeding on the attention of the room. "I have your file here, Mr. Crane." He held up a folder thin enough to be an insult. Quite a lot of claims for someone with very little documentation. "Lost paperwork, you say. 3 times, you say." He let out a theatrical sigh that echoed through the speakers. "I have to tell you, I hear this story at least 5 times a week." Elias's voice came out soft, almost hoarse from disuse. "I understand, sir. I'm just asking if someone could help me locate my records. I served for 24 years. The records exist somewhere." 24 years. Moss let the words hang in the air with visible skepticism. "And what exactly did you do for 24 years? Before Elias could answer, Moss continued. "Let me guess. Special operations. Classified missions. Things you cannot talk about because they're too secret." He looked out at the audience, inviting them to share in his amusement. "I have heard it all before, Mr. Crane. Every homeless veteran who walks through those doors was apparently a Navy SEAL or a Green Beret or some kind of secret agent." A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. A woman in the 3rd row, retired Sergeant Major Curtis Delaney's wife, put her hand on her husband's arm as if to steady him. In the back row, a young reporter named Valerie Tran quietly raised her phone and pressed record. Elias did not react to the mockery. His face remained calm, his posture unchanged. Only the slight tightening of his grip on Raymond's medical pouch betrayed any emotion at all. The worn leather had been with him for 40 years, through jungles that did not appear on any map and deserts where the sand turned to glass under artillery fire. It was the only thing of value he still possessed. Moss noticed the pouch and gestured toward it. "What is it you're holding on so tightly? Some kind of prop to make your story more convincing?" "This belonged to my instructor," Elias said quietly. "He died teaching me how to save lives." Moss rolled his eyes with the exaggerated weariness of a man who believed himself surrounded by liars. "Very dramatic. You should write a book. Wherever you are watching from right now, drop a comment and let us know." Stories of hidden heroes happen in every community. The veterans standing next to you in line the elderly man at the bus stop, the woman with weathered hands at the grocery store. Any one of them might carry secrets that would bring you to tears. If stories like this speak to you, consider subscribing to our channel. Now, let us continue. The silence in the room had taken on weight. Other veterans watched with expressions ranging from anger to resignation. They had seen this performance before. They knew how it ended. The homeless man would be dismissed, his claims denied, his dignity stripped away in public view. The system would continue as it always had. But Curtis Delaney could not look away from the old man at the microphone. Something about the way he stood, the precision of his movements, the scar that ran from temple to jaw like a road map of violence survived. And the pouch. Curtis had seen medical pouches like that before, carried by men whose job was to hold death at bay with nothing but skill and determination. Moss was still talking, his voice filling the room with contempt. So tell me, Mr. Crane, since you claim 24 years of service, since you claim all these lost records, let us start with something simple. What unit did you serve in? The question hung in the air. Elias Crane, who had not lifted his head to meet another person's eyes in 6 years, slowly raised his gaze. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. 5th Special Forces Group. Moss laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. Special Forces. Of course. Everyone who walks in here was Special Forces. But Curtis Delaney was no longer listening to Moss. His attention was fixed on the homeless man, on the scar, on the hands that moved with such terrible precision. 5th Special Forces Group. Mogadishu. The mile crawl. The medic they called Shepard. The one they said died in Afghanistan in 2002. His wife felt him trembling and gripped his arm harder. Moss leaned forward, enjoying himself. If you were really Special Forces, you should have no problem telling us your MOS. Your specialty. Come on, impress me. The room waited, and Elias Crane, who had spent 6 years hiding from everything he once was, opened his mouth to speak the words that would change everything. His voice came out barely above a whisper. But somehow, in that echoing room, everyone heard it. 18 Delta, Special Forces Medical Sergeant. In the third row, Curtis Delaney stopped breathing. Because 18 Delta medics from 5th Special Forces Group, who served in Mogadishu, were not common. And the one they called Shepard, the one who had crawled through hell to save 13 Rangers in a single night, was supposed to be dead. Moss was already preparing his next dismissive comment when he noticed that something in the room had shifted. The homeless man was still standing in the same spot, still holding the same worn pouch. But he was no longer looking down. He was looking directly at Franklin Moss with eyes that had seen things no bureaucrat could imagine. And in that moment, though he did not yet understand why, Franklin Moss felt the first cold tendril of fear wrap around his chest. The words hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. 18 Delta, Special Forces Medical Sergeant. Elias had not spoken those words aloud in over 2 decades, and saying them now felt like tearing open a wound he had spent years trying to ignore. His hand tightened on the leather pouch at his belt, and without warning, the fluorescent lights of the VA community room faded away. He was 23 years old again, standing in a jungle that did not exist on any official map. The humidity pressed against his skin like a living thing. Insects screamed in the canopy overhead, and Sergeant First Class Raymond Okonkwo stood before him, arms crossed, watching Elias struggle to stop the bleeding from a wound that had already taken too much. "You are losing him," Raymond said. His voice carried the accent of his Nigerian childhood, softened by 2 decades in American special operations. "What are you doing wrong?" Elias's hands were covered in blood. The local asset on the ground before him had stopped breathing 30 seconds ago. "I cannot find the bleeder. There's too much damage." Raymond knelt beside him, his own hands moving with a speed and precision that seemed impossible. He found the severed artery in seconds, clamped it with a hemostat that appeared from nowhere, and began working to repair what Elias had failed to fix. But even as he worked, he spoke. "You will lose men, Shepard. That is the cost of this work." His fingers never stopped moving. "But you will save more than you lose. That is the gift. Do you understand? The gift is not perfection. The gift is persistence. You save the one in front of you, and then you save the next one, and you keep saving them until your hands give out or your heart stops. The asset died anyway. Too much blood lost before they reached him. Raymond closed the man's eyes with gentle fingers and then turned to Elias with an expression that held no judgment. "Remember his face," Raymond said. "Remember all their faces. The ones you lose will teach you how to save the ones who come after. That is how this works." Elias remembered. He remembered every face. 40 years of faces, some saved and some lost, all of them carved into his memory like names on a memorial wall. The fluorescent lights flickered back into focus. The VA community room materialized around him. Franklin Moss was saying something, his voice sharp with irritation, but Elias could not hear the words. He was still half in that jungle, still feeling Raymond's hand on his shoulder, still hearing the voice of the man who had taught him everything. Raymond Okonkwo died 18 months after that night in the jungle. An ambush on a road that was supposed to be secure. 3 rounds caught him in the chest before anyone could react. Elias had been 20 feet away when it happened, close enough to watch Raymond fall, close enough to see the surprise in his mentor's eyes. He reached Raymond in seconds. The wounds were catastrophic. Any other medic would have known it was hopeless. But Elias was not any other medic. He was Raymond's student, and Raymond had taught him that hopeless was just a word used by people who had given up too soon. For 11 minutes, Elias worked on his dying mentor in the mud of that foreign road. His hands moved through procedures Raymond himself had taught him. TESL, needle decompression, pressure on the femoral bleed that would not stop no matter how hard he pressed. Around him, the firefight continued. Rounds snapped overhead. His teammates returned fire and screamed for extraction. But Elias heard none of it. His entire world had narrowed to the man beneath his hands and the fading pulse he was desperate to save. Raymond's eyes found his somewhere in the middle of it all. His lips moved, forming words that barely made it past his throat. "Do not stop. Finish the operation. Save the others." "I'm not leaving you," Elias said. Raymond's hand, weak and trembling, reached up to grip Elias's wrist. "The gift, Shepherd. Do not waste it on guilt. Use it." And when he closed his eyes for the final time, Elias kept working. His hands would not stop. The gift demanded completion, even when completion meant preparing a body for transport rather than saving a life. Elias carried Raymond's medical pouch out of that jungle. He had carried it every day since. Through the burning streets of Mogadishu and the mountain passes of Afghanistan. Through the slow collapse of his marriage and the death of his wife and the 6 years of exile he had imposed upon himself. The leather had worn soft with age, the buckles tarnished with time, but he had never opened it. He was afraid of what he might find inside, afraid that Raymond's voice, which still echoed in his memory after all these years, might finally fall silent. The community room was watching him. Moss was demanding something, his face red with the frustration of being ignored. But Elias was looking at his own hands, seeing them as they had been that night, covered in Raymond's blood, still trying to save a man who was already gone. Nadine had understood. His wife had always understood the weight he carried, even when he could not explain it. She had held him through the nightmares and talked him through the guilt and loved him despite the parts of himself he could not bring home from the wars. When she got sick, when the cancer diagnosis came through while he was deployed on the other side of the world, she had not told him. She had not wanted him to abandon his mission for her sake. She had died believing he would make it home in time. He arrived 2 days after her funeral. His son Damon, 22 years old and freshly accepted to medical school, met him at the door with eyes that held no accusation. Only grief, only the desperate need for his father to still be there. But Elias could not stay. Every time he looked at Damon, he saw Nadine's eyes looking back at him. Every time he walked through their home, he smelled her perfume and heard her laughter and felt the weight of every moment he had missed crushing down on his chest. He had spent 24 years saving strangers while his wife died alone. What kind of man did that make him? He left a note on the kitchen table, his wedding ring beside it. 3 sentences that he had rewritten a dozen times before settling on words that felt like surrender. I love you. I am sorry. Live your life and do not look for me. 6 years. 6 years of sleeping under bridges and eating from dumpsters and watching his son from a distance as Damon graduated medical school, got married, had a daughter Elias had never held. 6 years of believing he did not deserve warmth or comfort or help. 6 years of carrying Raymond's pouch and Nadine's memory in the faces of every man he had ever lost. And now Franklin Moss was demanding to know what unit he served in, demanding proof of a life that had nearly killed him to live. Across the room, Curtis Delaney was staring at him with an expression Elias could not read. The older veteran's face had gone pale, his hands gripping the armrests of his plastic chair. His wife whispered something in his ear, but Curtis did not respond. He was looking at the scar on Elias's face, at the pouch on his belt, at the hands that had not stopped trembling since the words 18 Delta left his lips. Moss slammed his palm on the table. Are you listening to me? I asked you a question. Elias blinked. The jungle faded. Raymond's voice fell silent. He was back in the fluorescent present, facing a man who had never held a dying friend and never would. I apologize, sir. Elias's voice was steady despite everything churning beneath the surface. What was your question? Moss smiled the smile of a man who believed he had won. I asked where you served. Give me dates. Give me operations. Prove that you're who you claim to be. The room waited. Curtis Delaney held his breath, and Elias Crane, who had spent 6 years hiding from his own history, felt something shift in his chest. Raymond's voice, quiet but clear, the gift is not perfection. The gift is persistence. Elias lifted his head and met Franklin Moss's eyes. How much time do you have? Franklin Moss leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a cat cornering a mouse. How much time do I have? He repeated, mimicking Elias's words with theatrical contempt. Oh, this should be good. Please, enlighten us all with your incredible military career. He gestured broadly to the room. We are all waiting with bated breath. A veteran in the second row muttered something under his breath. The woman beside him put a hand on his arm, but her own expression had hardened with anger. They had all seen this before. They had all been on the receiving end of bureaucratic cruelty at one point or another. But something about watching it happen to the old man at the microphone felt different. There was a stillness to him that did not match his circumstances, a dignity that Moss's mockery could not seem to touch. Elias spoke quietly. Panama, December 1989. Operation Just Cause. I was attached to a strike team targeting PDF command structures in Panama City. Moss waved his hand dismissively. Panama. Everyone claims Panama. What else? Desert Storm. January through March 1991. Forward surgical team, Mercy missions behind Iraqi lines. We extracted 17 coalition POWs from a facility that was not supposed to exist. Moss made a show of writing something on his notepad. Very dramatic. Secret facilities. Covert extractions. You really have seen all the movies, have you not? Curtis Delaney's hands had begun to shake. His wife Margaret noticed and leaned close to whisper something, but Curtis shook his head sharply. He could not take his eyes off the man at the microphone. The scar. The bearing. The way he listed operations with the flat precision of someone reading from a classified file rather than inventing stories. Curtis had spent 30 years in the Army, most of it in the 75th Ranger Regiment. He knew what real operators looked like. He knew the difference between fantasy and the weight of actual service. And he knew the legend of Shepard. Every Ranger who served in the 90s knew the legend of Shepard. The Special Forces medic who crawled through the streets of Mogadishu during the worst firefight in American military history since Vietnam. The man who saved 13 Rangers in a single night, performing surgery in the dirt while bullets tore the air around him. The man whose real name was classified, whose face was never photographed, whose story was told in whispers at Ranger School and in bars where veterans gathered to remember the dead. They said Shepard died in Afghanistan in 2002. They said he went into the mountains during Operation Anaconda and never came out. His body was never recovered. His name was added to the memorial wall at Fort Bragg with a star beside it indicating classified circumstances of death. But Curtis was looking at the scar that ran from temple to jaw, and he was remembering a story he had heard 20 years ago. A story about a medic who took shrapnel from an RPG in Mogadishu, shrapnel that should have killed him, but instead just carved a permanent reminder into his face. Moss was still talking, his voice rising with each word. Somalia, I suppose? Let me guess, you were there for Black Hawk Down? You probably saved the whole city single-handedly? The room went quiet. Elias's expression did not change. His voice remained soft and steady. October 3rd and 4th, 1993. I was attached to Task Force Ranger as a Special Forces medical advisor. Moss laughed, but the sound had a nervous edge to it now. The silence in the room was pressing against him, and he did not understand why. Of course you were. And I suppose you have some incredible story about saving lives under fire? Elias said nothing. His hand moved unconsciously to touch the scar on his face, tracing the raised line of tissue from temple to jaw. Curtis Delaney stood up. Every head in the room turned toward him. Margaret grabbed for his arm, but he pulled away gently. His legs felt unsteady, but he forced them to carry him toward the aisle. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Moss frowned at the interruption. Sir, please remain seated. This is not your concern. Curtis ignored him. He was staring at Elias with an intensity that bordered on desperation. His voice cracked when he spoke. That scar. Where did you get it? Elias met the old ranger's eyes for a long moment. Something passed between them. Recognition of a shared weight, a shared history, a shared understanding of what it meant to survive when others did not. RPG, Elias said quietly. October 3rd, corner of Hallwaydig Road and the alley we called Dead Man's Turn. Shrapnel took out 2 men beside me and left me with this. Curtis's knees nearly buckled. He caught himself on the back of a chair, his face gone white as paper. Margaret was calling his name, but he could not hear her. He could only hear the blood rushing in his ears and the memory of a story told in a bar in Fort Benning 20 years ago. The medic who saved Tommy Reardon. The medic who crawled 4 blocks under continuous fire with Tommy on his back because the kid had taken rounds to both legs and could not walk. The medic who set up a casualty collection point in a bombed-out building and kept 13 men alive through 9 hours of hell while the city burned around them. They called him Shepherd because he would not leave his flock behind. Moss was standing now, his face red with confusion and anger. What is going on here? Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to return to your seat immediately. Curtis did not move. His eyes remained locked on Elias. Hallwaydig Road, he said slowly. October 3rd. 3rd Ranger Battalion was pinned down 6 blocks east of the first crash site. We lost 4 men in the first 20 minutes. And then a medic came out of nowhere, crawled through crossfire like the bullets could not touch him, stayed with us for 9 hours while we waited for extraction that did not come until dawn. The room had gone absolutely silent. Even Moss had stopped talking, though his face showed no understanding of what was happening. Curtis's voice broke on the next words. They told us his name was classified. They told us he died in 2002. But I remember the scar. I remember the way he moved. And I remember what he said to Tommy Reardon before he carried him 4 blocks through enemy fire. Elias closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been the reflection of fluorescent lights on old grief. What did he say? Curtis asked, though he already knew the answer. What did the medic say to Tommy before he picked him up? Elias's voice came out barely above a whisper. I said, hold on to my neck and do not let go. I'm taking you home. Curtis Delaney made a sound that was half sob and half laugh. He turned to face Franklin Moss with an expression of absolute fury. You have no idea, he said, his voice shaking with 30 years of gratitude finally given a target. You have no idea who you have been mocking. This man is not a liar. This man is not faking anything. This man is a legend. Moss opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time since the meeting began, uncertainty flickered across his face. And in the back of the room, Valerie Tran held her phone steady, capturing every moment of what was about to become the most watched video in the history of veteran advocacy. The word legend hung in the air like an accusation. Elias flinched from it the way a man flinches from a blow he knows he deserves. He had never wanted to be a legend. He had only wanted to bring his men home. And the truth that Curtis Delaney did not know, the truth that no one in this room could understand, was that legends were built on the bodies of the men who did not make it. 13 men saved in Mogadishu. The number followed him like a ghost. 13 men who went home to their families because Elias had crawled through fire to reach them. 13 men who lived because he refused to stop, refused to give up, refused to accept that the city had already decided who would die. But no one talked about the 4. 4 men died in that alley before Elias could reach them. 4 men whose names were tattooed on his chest alongside dozens of others. 4 men whose faces he saw every time he closed his eyes, whose voices he heard in the quiet hours before dawn when sleep refused to come. Specialist Derek Wong, 19 years old, took a round through the throat while Elias was still 50 meters away. Bled out in 45 seconds, calling for his mother in a language Elias did not speak. Private First Class William Oduya, 22 years old. Shrapnel from the same RPG that scarred Elias's face opened his abdomen like a zipper. Elias held his intestines in place for 6 minutes, talking to him the whole time, promising him that help was coming, knowing that no help would be enough. Sergeant Antonio Vega, 28 years old, father of 3, shot through the pelvis while providing covering fire so Elias could reach the wounded. He lived for 2 hours, conscious the whole time, asking Elias to tell his wife that he was sorry for missing their anniversary. Corporal James Whitfield, 24 years old, the last man Elias lost that night. He died just before dawn, just before the extraction convoy finally broke through. A single round through the heart, fired from a window Elias had thought was clear. Whitfield had been talking about the fishing trip he was going to take with his father when he got home. Mid-sentence, he was gone. Elias carried their dog tags out of Mogadishu. He carried them through every deployment that followed. He carried them still, tucked inside Raymond's medical pouch alongside the tags of every other man he had failed to save over 24 years of service. Franklin Moss was saying something, his voice high and defensive, but Elias could not hear the words. He was back in that alley, back in that endless night, watching Derek Wong reach for him with bloody fingers as the light left his eyes. You cannot save everyone, Raymond had told him once. The gift is not omnipotence. The gift is the willingness to try when others have given up. You save the ones you can, and you remember the ones you cannot. That is the burden. That is the honor. But Raymond had not known how heavy the burden would become. Raymond had not lived long enough to see how the faces accumulated, how they stacked up year after year until the weight of them crushed everything else. Raymond had not been there when Nadine got sick, when Elias chose a mission over his dying wife, when the burden of the dead finally outweighed his will to live among the living. Curtis Delaney was still standing in the aisle, his face a mask of barely controlled emotion. The other veterans in the room watched in silence, sensing that something profound was unfolding but not yet understanding its full shape. Valerie Tran kept her phone steady, documenting everything. Moss had retreated a step from the table, his confidence visibly shaken. He looked to his fellow administrators for support, but they offered nothing. They were bureaucrats, paper pushers, people who had never seen the things that haunted the men in this room. They had no frame of reference for what was happening. Tell them, Curtis said, his voice rough with decades of suppressed gratitude. Tell them what you did. Tell them who you are. Elias shook his head slowly. It does not matter who I was. What matters is that my paperwork has been lost 3 times, and I need help finding it. That is all I came here for. Curtis took a step closer. His hands were trembling, but his voice grew stronger. It matters. It matters because men like him, he jabbed a finger toward Moss, need to understand who they are dismissing. They need to understand what they are spitting on when they mock veterans who come here asking for help. I did not come here for recognition, Elias said quietly. Then why did you come? Curtis demanded. Why now, after all these years? Why show up at a VA town hall when you've spent God knows how long living on the streets? The question hit Elias like a physical blow. He had asked himself the same thing 1,000 times. Why now? Why, after 6 years of hiding, had he finally walked through those doors? The answer was simple and terrible and true. Because I am dying. The words came out before he could stop them. The room went silent in a different way now. Not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of shock. Curtis's face crumpled. What? Elias's hand moved to his chest, pressing against ribs that had begun to ache in ways he could no longer ignore. The cough that had started 6 months ago. The blood he had begun to see in the mornings. The weight he had lost without trying, until his donated clothes hung even looser than before. I do not know what it is, he said. I have not seen a doctor. I cannot see a doctor without documentation, without proof that I am who I say I am. He looked at Moss with eyes that held no anger, only exhaustion. I did not come here for glory. I came here because I'm running out of time, and before I go, I need to know that my service meant something. I need to know that someone, somewhere, has a record that proves I existed, that proves I did what I did, that proves the men I saved and the men I lost were real. The medical pouch felt heavy in his hand. 40 years of carrying Raymond's legacy, and now his own body was failing him the way so many bodies had failed under his hands. Moss opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For the first time, he seemed to see the man standing before him. Not a homeless vagrant trying to game the system. Not a liar spinning stories for benefits. Just an old soldier, worn down by decades of service, asking for help before it was too late. In the front row, a woman Elias had not noticed before rose slowly to her feet. She was in her 60s, well-dressed, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. A younger man beside her, clearly an aide, whispered something urgent, but she waved him off. Mr. Crane, she said, and her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. My name is Senator Margaret Holloway. I sit on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, and I believe I can help you find what you are looking for. Elias stared at her, uncomprehending. Senators did not attend VA town halls. Senators did not speak to homeless men with blood on their coughs and ghosts in their eyes. But Margaret Holloway was already pulling out her phone, her fingers moving with purpose. Because some legends, she said quietly, deserve to be remembered before they fade away. Franklin Moss watched Senator Holloway rise from her seat and felt the ground shifting beneath him. This was not how these meetings were supposed to go. He controlled these rooms. He decided who was credible and who was not. He had spent 15 years building a reputation as the man who separated the genuine veterans from the frauds, and he had never once been wrong. Until now, a small voice whispered. Until this homeless man with the scar and the trembling hands and the eyes that had seen too much. Moss straightened his tie and forced confidence into his voice. Senator Holloway, with all due respect, this is a regional VA matter. We have protocols for verifying service claims. We cannot simply take every story at face value because it sounds compelling. Senator Holloway turned to look at him, and something in her expression made Moss take an involuntary step backward. Mr. Moss, I have been attending these town halls across the country for the past 6 months. Do you know what I have found? Moss shook his head, not trusting his voice. I have found dedicated public servants doing their best with limited resources. She paused, letting the words settle. And I have found petty bureaucrats who use their positions to humiliate vulnerable people. Which one are you, Mr. Moss? The room seemed to hold its breath. Moss felt sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension. If I may. A woman in her late 50s stepped into the aisle from the far side of the room. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades navigating difficult situations. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and she wore simple clothes that suggested function over fashion. But her eyes held a warmth that seemed out of place in the cold fluorescent light of the VA community room. My name is Dr. Anita Weatherspoon, she said. I am a former Army nurse, and I currently run a reintegration clinic for combat veterans outside the VA system. Moss seized on this interruption like a drowning man grabbing a rope. Dr. Weatherspoon, this is a closed town hall meeting. If you have concerns about VA services, you can submit them through the proper channels. Dr. Weatherspoon ignored him completely. She was looking at Elias with an expression that Elias could not quite read. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe just the practiced assessment of a medical professional evaluating a patient. "I know you," she said softly. "I have seen you at the tent camp by the river. I have been watching you for months, waiting for the right moment to approach." Elias's hand tightened on Raymond's pouch. He remembered seeing her there, walking among the tents with bags of supplies, talking to the veterans who had fallen through every crack the system had to offer. He had avoided her deliberately, the way he avoided everyone who tried to help. "You do not need to run anymore," Dr. Weatherspoon said. "I am not here to force anything on you, but I want you to know that when you are ready, there's a place for you. No paperwork, no bureaucracy, just help. I do not deserve help." The words came out before Elias could stop them, raw and honest in a way he had not allowed himself to be in years. Dr. Weatherspoon took a step closer. Her voice was gentle but firm. "I have heard that from 100 men, just like you. Men who saved lives, who served with honor, who came home to find that the country they fought for had no place for them. Every single one of them believed they did not deserve help, and every single one of them was wrong." Curtis Delaney wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. His wife Margaret had given up trying to get him to sit down and now stood beside him, her own face wet with tears. The room had transformed. What had started as a routine town hall meeting had become something else entirely. Veterans who had come expecting disappointment and dismissal were now witnessing something they had never seen before. A homeless man, mocked and belittled by a bureaucrat, being recognized and defended by people who understood what he had sacrificed. Senator Holloway's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her expression shifted. "Mr. Crane, my aide is pulling your service record from the classified database. It may take a few minutes, but I promise you, we will find the documentation you need." Moss made one last attempt to regain control. "Senator, I must insist that we follow proper protocols. We cannot simply access classified records without authorization. I am on the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, Mr. Moss." Senator Holloway's voice could have frozen water. "I have authorization you cannot even imagine. Now sit down and be quiet. I will have you removed from this room." Moss sat. The silence that followed was broken only by the buzzing of the fluorescent lights and the soft sound of Curtis Delaney's breathing. The old ranger had not taken his eyes off Elias since standing up. 30 years of gratitude, 30 years of wondering what happened to the medic who saved his friend, all of it pressing against his chest like a physical weight. "Shepard," Curtis said, and the call sign sounded like a prayer. "I need to know, after Mogadishu, after everything you did, how did you end up here? How did a man like you end up sleeping in a tent by the river?" Elias closed his eyes. The question cut deeper than any of Moss's insults, deeper than the fear of his own mortality, deeper than the weight of the names tattooed on his chest. "I ran," he said finally. His voice was barely audible, but in the silence of the room, everyone heard. "After my wife died, after I realized I'd spent 24 years saving strangers while the people I loved suffered alone, I ran. I left my son a note telling him not to look for me. I walked away from everything I had ever built, and I have been running ever since." Dr. Weatherspoon moved closer, stopping just a few feet from where Elias stood. "Running is not a crime," she said softly. "Running is what we do when the weight becomes too heavy to carry alone. But you do not have to carry it alone anymore." Elias opened his eyes. For the first time in 6 years, he looked directly at someone offering help without flinching away. "I do not know how to stop," he admitted. Dr. Weatherspoon smiled, and it was the smile of someone who had helped broken men find their way back before. "You do not have to know how. You just have to be willing to try." In the back of the room, Valerie Tran lowered her phone for a moment. Her hands were shaking. She had come to this town hall expecting to document bureaucratic indifference, expecting to capture footage of veterans being mistreated by the system. Instead, she had witnessed something she could not quite name. A legend being rediscovered, a broken man being offered grace. A room full of strangers becoming something like a family. She raised her phone again, just as Senator Holloway's aide rushed back into the room, tablet in hand, face pale with what he'd found. "Senator," the aide said, his voice unsteady. "You need to see this. His file. His complete service record. It is." He trailed off, unable to find words sufficient for what was on screen. Senator Holloway took the tablet. She read in silence for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Mr. Crane," she said slowly, "or should I call you by your call sign?" She paused, letting the weight of the moment build. "Shepard, the man who was declared dead in 2002. The man whose classified service record reads like something out of a movie that would never be approved because no one would believe it was true." She turned the tablet toward the room, though the screen was too far away for most to read. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent room, "we are standing in the presence of one of the most decorated combat medics in the history of United States Special Operations. And we nearly let him die on our streets without ever knowing who he was." The words "most decorated combat medic in the history of United States Special Operations" echoed through the room like thunder after lightning. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The fluorescent lights continued their indifferent buzzing, but everything beneath them had changed. Franklin Moss stared at Senator Holloway with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. The confidence that had carried him through 15 years of dismissing veterans, of sorting the worthy from the unworthy based on nothing more than appearance and attitude, had evaporated completely. Senator Holloway continued reading from the tablet, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. "Distinguished Service Cross for actions during the Battle of Mogadishu, October 1993. Awarded for extraordinary heroism while under direct enemy fire." Citation reads, "Staff Sergeant Crane displayed complete disregard for his own safety while providing medical aid to wounded personnel across multiple locations during a 9-hour engagement. His actions directly resulted in the survival of 13 service members who would otherwise have succumbed to their injuries." Curtis Delaney let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. 13. "I knew it. I knew it was him." "There is more," Senator Holloway said. "2 silver stars. 1 for Panama, 1 for Desert Storm. 3 bronze stars with V device for valor in combat. Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters, indicating 3 separate awards for wounds received in action." She looked up from the tablet, her eyes finding Elias. "And a Medal of Honor recommendation that was downgraded to the Distinguished Service Cross because the operation it referenced was too classified to be made public." The room erupted in murmurs. A Medal of Honor recommendation, the highest military decoration in the United States, awarded only for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Even a recommendation for such an award was extraordinarily rare. Elias said nothing. His hand had found Raymond's pouch again, gripping the worn leather like an anchor. He had known about the recommendation, had been told about it years ago by a commanding officer who apologized for not being able to make it official. At the time, it had meant nothing to him. The medal would not bring back the men he had lost. The recognition would not fill the hollow space where his family had once been. "What operation?" Curtis asked, his voice hushed with reverence. "What did he do that warranted a Medal of Honor recommendation?" Senator Holloway hesitated. "The file indicates the details remain classified at the highest level, but the summary states that Staff Sergeant Crane single-handedly extracted 14 wounded personnel from a surrounded position over a period of 6 hours while under continuous enemy fire. He sustained multiple gunshot wounds during the extraction but refused evacuation until all personnel were secured. 14 men," someone in the audience whispered. "He saved 14 men while he was shot." Dr. Weatherspoon had moved closer to Elias, close enough to see the tremor in his hands, close enough to notice the way his breathing had become shallow and rapid. She recognized the signs. Panic attack, dissociation, the trauma response of a man being forced to confront a past he had spent years trying to bury. "Mr. Crane," she said softly, pitching her voice so only he could hear. "You do not have to stay for this. If you need to step outside, I will come with you. No one will think less of you." Elias shook his head. His jaw was clenched tight, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance that no one else could see. "I have run enough," he said. His voice was strained but determined. "Whatever happens next, I am staying." Moss had risen from his chair, though he seemed unaware of having done so. His face had gone from red to white to a sickly gray. He was staring at Elias with an expression that mixed horror with dawning comprehension. "I do not know," he said. The words came out barely above a whisper. "How could I have known? He looks like... Like what?" Curtis demanded, his voice sharp with anger. "Like a homeless man? Like someone who does not deserve respect? Like someone you could mock and humiliate without consequences?" Moss flinched as if struck. "I was just doing my job. We get so many false claims. So many people trying to take advantage of the system. I have to be skeptical. I have to question everyone." Senator Holloway set down the tablet. "Mr. Moss, there is a difference between healthy skepticism and cruelty. What I witnessed today was not an administrator doing his job. It was a bully using his position to humiliate a vulnerable person." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I will be recommending a full review of your conduct and the conduct of this regional office." The other administrators at the table had gone pale. They had sat in silence throughout the entire confrontation, unwilling to challenge Moss, but equally unwilling to defend him. Now, they shifted in their seats, already calculating how to distance themselves from the coming fallout. Elias suddenly swayed on his feet. Dr. Weatherspoon reached out to steady him, her hand gripping his elbow with practiced firmness. He was burning up, she realized. Fever. Whatever was wrong with him, whatever illness had driven him to finally seek help, it was worse than he had let on. "When did you last eat?" she asked quietly. Elias had to think about it. 2 days ago, maybe 3. He had stopped keeping track of such things long ago. Food was fuel, nothing more, and fuel was hard to come by when you lived in a tent by the river. Dr. Weatherspoon's expression tightened. "We need to get you to a hospital." "No." Elias's response was immediate and sharp. "Not until this is finished. Not until they have what they need." Curtis stepped forward, positioning himself on Elias's other side. The two of them, the doctor and the old ranger, formed a protective barrier around the man who had once crawled through hell to save others. "Then let us finish it," Curtis said. He looked at Senator Holloway. "What else does the file say? What happened to him after Mogadishu? How did a man with that record end up declared dead?" Senator Holloway scrolled through the tablet, her brow furrowing as she read. "After Somalia, he continued serving with 5th Special Forces Group. Multiple deployments throughout the late 90s. Then came September 11th, 2001. He was among the first special operations personnel deployed to Afghanistan." She paused, reading ahead. "In March 2002, during Operation Anaconda, he was part of a team inserted into the Shahi Kot Valley. The team was ambushed and surrounded. Communications were lost. When relief forces finally reached their position 3 days later, they found evidence of a prolonged firefight and signs that wounded personnel had been evacuated. But Staff Sergeant Crane was not among the survivors recovered." "What happened to him?" Curtis asked. Senator Holloway looked up from the tablet, her eyes finding Elias. "That is what I would like to know," she said. "Mr. Crane, the official record says you died in those mountains. Clearly, that is not true. So what really happened? How did you survive when everyone believed you were dead?" The room fell silent again, every eye turning to the homeless man standing between the doctor and the ranger. Elias's face had gone pale beneath the weathered tan, his scars standing out in sharp relief against bloodless skin. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I survived because 14 men needed me to survive." He paused, his hand pressing against his chest where the names were tattooed beneath his shirt. "But the man I was before those mountains, the soldier, the medic, the husband, the father, that man did die up there. What came down was something else. Something broken. Something that did not deserve to go home." His eyes found Senator Holloway's. "So I did not go home. I let them think I was dead because it was easier than explaining why I could not be who they needed me to be anymore. I walked away from everything, and I have been walking ever since. The confession hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been burning for 20 years. I let them think I was dead because it was easier than explaining why I could not be who they needed me to be anymore. The words had cost Elias something to speak, something he could feel tearing loose in his chest like old scar tissue, finally giving way. Curtis Delaney's grip on his arm tightened. "You had a family," he said, and it was not an accusation. It was the quiet recognition of one broken man seeing himself in another. "You had people waiting for you." Elias nodded slowly. "A wife, a son, Nadine and Damon." He spoke their names like prayers he had not allowed himself to utter in years. "I love them more than anything in the world, more than my own life, more than any mission or medal or moment of glory." But love was not enough. It was never enough. Dr. Weatherspoon's hand remained steady on his elbow, monitoring his pulse through the thin fabric of his sleeve. She could feel his heart racing, could see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill of the air-conditioned room. Whatever was killing him, it was accelerating. They did not have much time. "Tell us," she said gently. "Tell us what happened after the mountains." Elias closed his eyes. The fluorescent lights seemed to dim around him, or perhaps it was just his vision narrowing as the memories rushed back. He had spent 6 years trying to outrun these memories, trying to bury them beneath layers of hunger and cold and deliberate isolation. Now they demanded to be heard. "When the extraction team found us, I had been awake for 72 hours. His voice was distant, mechanical, reciting fact from a report he had written in his own blood. 14 men wounded, 3 of them critical. I had used every piece of medical equipment we had and improvised the rest. Tourniquets made from rifle slings. Chest seals made from MRE packaging and duct tape. I performed 2 field amputations with a combat knife because gangrene was setting in and there was no other way." Someone in the audience made a sound of disbelief. Curtis's wife Margaret had pressed her hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "By the time they reached us, I had been shot twice. Once in the shoulder, once in the thigh. I had lost enough blood that I should not have been standing. But I was standing because if I stopped standing, the men depending on me would die." Elias opened his eyes, and they were empty in a way that made Dr. Weatherspoon's heart clench. "So I kept standing. I kept working. I kept saving them until there was nothing left of me to save." The extraction team wanted to evacuate him immediately. He had refused. There were wounded men who needed to go first, men whose injuries were more severe, men who had families waiting for them. By the time the last helicopter lifted off with the final casualty, Elias had collapsed in the snow, his body finally surrendering to the damage it could no longer ignore. He woke up 3 weeks later in a hospital in Germany. The doctors told him he was lucky to be alive. They told him his wounds would heal, that physical therapy would restore most of his function, that he could return to active duty within a year if he wanted to. But something had changed in those mountains. Something had broken that no amount of physical therapy could repair. "I cannot feel anything," Elias said. His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "For 3 weeks, I lay in that hospital bed, and I felt nothing. No relief at surviving. No grief for the men we had lost. No joy when Nadine's letters arrived. Nothing. It was like someone had reached inside me and turned off every switch that made me human." The doctors called it severe dissociation, a trauma response. They recommended psychiatric evaluation, medication, long-term therapy. Elias had nodded along with their recommendations, and then, the moment he was cleared for discharge, he had walked out of the hospital and disappeared. "I cannot go home to them like that," he said. "Nadine deserved a husband who could love her. Damon deserved a father who could feel something when he looked at him. What I had become in those mountains, that thing did not deserve to be in their lives. So I let the army list me as missing in action. I let them presume me dead, and I walked away." Curtis's voice was rough with emotion. "Where did you go?" "Everywhere. Nowhere." Elias's laugh was hollow and brief. "I spent 5 years moving from city to city, country to country, trying to outrun the emptiness. I took odd jobs when I needed money. I slept in shelters when I could not afford anything else. And slowly, year by year, I started to feel things again. Small things at first. The warmth of the sun on my face. The taste of a hot meal. The sound of rain on a tin roof. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice cracked for the first time. And then I felt the grief. All at once, like a dam breaking. Everything I had not allowed myself to feel for 5 years came rushing back. And I thought it would kill me. I wanted it to kill me. I stood on a bridge in Seattle and looked down at the water and thought about how easy it would be to just let go. Dr. Weatherspoon's grip on his arm tightened. But you did not let go. No. Elias shook his head, because I heard Raymond's voice. My instructor, the man whose pouch I still carry. He told me once that the gift was not perfection. The gift was persistence. He told me to save the ones I could and remember the ones I could not. And standing on that bridge, I realized that I had been so focused on the ones I could not save that I had forgotten about the ones I could. He turned to look at Curtis, at Dr. Weatherspoon, at the room full of veterans who had come seeking help and found something else entirely. I came down from that bridge. I made my way back to this city where Nadine is buried, where Damon still lives. I did not have the courage to face them, but I could be close to them. I could watch from a distance. I could see that they were okay. Your son, Senator Holloway, said softly. Does he know you are alive? Elias shook his head. No, and I was never going to tell him. I was going to live out whatever time I have left in that tent by the river, watching him from the shadows, and then I was going to die without ever letting him know the truth. Then why come here today? Dr. Weatherspoon asked. Why now? Because I realized that dying without a record means dying without proof. Elias's voice steadied, gaining strength from conviction. It means that everything I did, everyone I saved, every brother I lost, all of it disappears with me. And I could accept my own erasure, but I could not accept erasing them. His hand pressed against his chest, against the names tattooed beneath his shirt. I came here for them. For Derek Huang and William Odia and Antonio Vega and James Whitfield. For Raymond Okonkwo. For every man whose name I carry. I came here so that someone, somewhere, would know that they existed, that they mattered, that they did not die for nothing. The room was absolutely silent. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to have stopped their buzzing, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Senator Holloway wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Mr. Crane, she said, her voice thick with emotion, I promise you, their names will not be forgotten, and neither will yours. Elias looked at her with eyes that held something they had not held in years. Hope, fragile and uncertain, but present nonetheless. Then I have one more request, he said. His voice was steady now, calm with the peace of a man who has finally stopped running. Name it, Senator Holloway said. Elias took a deep breath. I would like to see my son. I would like to see my son. The words seemed to echo in the silence of the room, carrying a weight that pressed against the chest of everyone who heard them. 6 words. 6 simple words that represented the end of 6 years of running, 6 years of hiding, 6 years of watching from the shadows while his only child lived a life without knowing his father was still alive. Senator Holloway nodded slowly, her composure cracking just slightly at the edges. We can arrange that, Mr. Crane. I will have my staff reach out to him immediately. Elias shook his head. No, not like that. Not with strangers calling him to deliver news that will turn his world upside down. He paused, gathering himself for what he needed to say next. I need to be the one to tell him. I owe him that much. I owe him more than that, but it is all I have left to give. Franklin Moss had not moved from where he stood behind the administrator's table. His face had taken on the gray pallor of a man watching his career crumble in real time. Everything he had built, every assumption he had made, every veteran he had dismissed with casual cruelty, all of it was being exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. There was nothing left to say. Curtis Delaney stepped closer to Elias, his weathered face set with determination. You do not have to do this alone, Shepard. Whatever happens next, you have people standing with you now. The use of the call sign sent a visible tremor through Elias. He had not been Shepard in over 2 decades. He had been nobody, a ghost drifting through a world that had moved on without him. But here, in this room full of strangers who had become witnesses to his resurrection, the name felt less like a burden and more like an anchor. "There is something I need to show you," Elias said quietly. "All of you. Before we contact Damon, before anything else happens, you need to understand what I carry with me. What I have been carrying for 24 years. His hands moved to the hem of his faded olive drab shirt. The fabric was thin, worn soft by years of wear and countless washings in public restroom sinks. He hesitated for just a moment, his fingers trembling against the cloth. Dr. Weatherspoon placed her hand gently on his arm. "You do not have to do this." "Yes," Elias said. "I do." He pulled the shirt over his head in one smooth motion, revealing a torso that made several people in the room gasp audibly. Senator Holloway's hand flew to her mouth. Curtis Delaney let out a sound that was half prayer and half curse. Even Valerie Tran, who had documented countless stories of veteran suffering, lowered her phone for a moment, unable to process what she was seeing. Elias's body was a landscape of violence survived. Scars crisscrossed his chest and abdomen like the lines on a road map, each one representing a wound that should have ended his life. The bullet wound in his shoulder had healed into a puckered crater of scar tissue. The one in his thigh, hidden beneath his pants, had left him with a permanent limp he had learned to disguise. Burns from an IED in Desert Storm had melted the skin across his left ribs into a smooth, shiny surface that no longer grew hair. But it was not the scars that drew the eye. It was the ink, tattooed across every inch of unmarked skin, in script so small it required close examination to read, were names. Dozens of names, perhaps hundreds. They covered his chest like armor made of memory. They wrapped around his sides and climbed up toward his shoulders. They disappeared beneath the waistband of his pants, suggesting they continued down his legs as well. Curtis stepped forward, his eyes scanning the names with growing recognition. "These are soldiers." Elias nodded. "Every man I lost. Every man who died under my hands, or in my arms, or within reach of my voice. I carry them with me. I will carry them until I die." He turned slowly, allowing the room to see his back. More names there, more than the front, covering him from the base of his skull to the small of his back. In the center of his shoulder blades, larger than the others, a single name stood out: Raymond Okonkwo. Beneath it, a date and a set of coordinates marking the place where Elias's mentor had taken his final breath. Senator Holloway's aide had stopped typing on his tablet. Tears were streaming down his face. He was a young man, barely 30, and he had never served. But he understood what he was looking at. A memorial made of flesh. A monument carried by a single man who had refused to let the dead be forgotten. Curtis reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers hovering over a name near Elias's collarbone without quite touching. "Tommy Reardon," he read aloud. "October 3rd, 1993. He did not die," Elias said, "but he nearly did. I tattoo the names of the ones I lost, and the names of the ones who came closest. The ones who taught me something about the boundary between life and death." Curtis's voice broke. "You saved him. You crawled 4 blocks through enemy fire and you saved him." "I saved 13 men that night," Elias said. His voice was flat, reciting facts without emotion. "But I lost 4. Their names are here too. Derek Huang, William Oduya, Antonio Vega, James Whitfield." He touched each name as he spoke it, his fingers finding them without needing to look. "I remember exactly where each one is. I could find them in the dark." The room had gone completely still. Even the air seemed to have stopped moving, as if the building itself was paying respect to the dead whose names adorned this broken man's body. Dr. Weatherspoon stepped forward, her professional assessment overlaying her emotional response. "Mr. Crane, some of these scars show signs of infection. Recent infection, combined with your other symptoms, the fever, the weight loss, the cough you've been trying to hide, we need to get you medical attention immediately." After Elias said, "After I see my son." You may not have an after if we do not treat you now. Elias met her eyes with a gaze that had faced death more times than most people could imagine. I have waited 6 years to see my son. I have watched him from across streets and through windows and from the back of auditoriums where he gave speeches at medical conferences. I have seen him become the man his mother always believed he could be. And I have done all of it from the shadows because I was too much a coward to face him. He pulled his shirt back over his head, the names disappearing beneath the faded fabric. I'm not a coward anymore. Whatever time I've left, whether it is days or weeks or months, I'm going to spend it as the man Raymond taught me to be. The man who does not stop. The man who saves the ones in front of him and remembers the ones he could not save. He turned to Senator Holloway. Call my son. Tell him his father is alive. Tell him I am at the VA regional office downtown. His voice steadied, gaining strength with each word. Tell him I am ready to stop running. Senator Holloway nodded, reaching for her phone. And in the back of the room, Valerie Tran raised her camera once more, documenting the moment when a ghost decided to become a man again. Senator Holloway stepped away from the group, her phone pressed to her ear. The room watched in silence as she spoke in low tones, her free hand gesturing with the urgency of someone delivering news that would shatter a stranger's world. After a moment, she lowered the phone and turned back to face Elias. He is on his way, she said. Your son. He works at Memorial Hospital, less than 10 minutes from here. He is coming now. Elias swayed slightly, and Curtis steadied him with a firm hand on his shoulder. The reality of what was about to happen seemed to crash over him like a wave. 6 years of hiding. 6 years of watching from the shadows. And now, in less than 10 minutes, he would stand face to face with the son he had abandoned. What did he say? Elias asked. His voice was barely audible. Senator Holloway's expression softened. He said he had been looking for you. Every day, for 6 years. He never stopped. The words hit Elias like a physical blow. He had convinced himself that leaving was the kindest thing he could do. He had told himself that Damon was better off without a broken father haunting his life. But his son had never stopped searching. His son had never given up. While they waited, something remarkable began to happen in the room. Word had spread. Veterans who had been sitting in the back rows, who had come to the town hall with their own problems and their own paperwork, began to move forward. They approached in ones and twos, their faces marked with the particular reverence that soldiers reserve for legends. An older man in a faded army jacket was the first to speak. I was in Desert Storm, he said, his voice rough with emotion. 3rd Armored Division. We heard stories about a Green Beret medic who crossed enemy lines to extract POWs from an Iraqi facility. They said he carried 2 men out on his back, one after the other, through 3 miles of hostile territory. Elias nodded slowly. Sergeant Morrison and Corporal Webb. They had been held for 6 days. Morrison had a broken femur. Webb had internal bleeding. I could not leave them. The veteran's eyes filled with tears. Morrison was my platoon sergeant. He came home because of you. He lived another 22 years. Saw his grandchildren born. Died in his sleep last spring, surrounded by family. Another veteran stepped forward, this one younger, perhaps in his 40s. My uncle served in Panama. He told me about a medic who pulled him out of a collapsed building after the initial assault. Said the guy worked for 6 hours straight. No breaks, no rest, just moving from one wounded man to the next. Your uncle, Elias said. What was his name? Gutierrez. Staff Sergeant Manuel Gutierrez. A ghost of a smile crossed Elias's weathered face. Manny. He used to sing in Spanish while I worked on him. Said it helped with the pain. I still remember the songs. The veteran let out a choked laugh. He still sings those songs. Every family gathering. Drives us all crazy. One by one they came. Veterans whose lives have been touched by the legend of Shepherd, whether directly or through stories passed down through the years. A woman whose father had served in Mogadishu. A young man whose grandfather had been one of the 14 extracted from the mountains in Afghanistan. A retired colonel who had signed the Medal of Honor recommendation that had been downgraded due to classification concerns. I always regretted that, the colonel said, his voice heavy with old guilt. You deserved the recognition. You deserve to have the world know what you did. Elias shook his head. I did not do it for recognition. I did it because they needed me. That was always enough. Franklin Moss watched from behind the administrator's table, his face a mask of dawning horror. He had spent 15 years in this job. 15 years of sorting veterans into categories, deciding who was worthy and who was not based on nothing more than his own assumptions. And in all that time, he had never once considered that the ragged, homeless man in front of him might be carrying a weight he could not begin to comprehend. Curtis Delaney had not left Elias's side. The old ranger stood like a sentinel, his hand still resting on Elias's shoulder as if afraid the legend might disappear if he let go. Tommy Reardon, he said suddenly. I need to call him. He needs to know you are alive. Elias's breath caught. Tommy, is he still? He is alive, Curtis said. 3 kids, 6 grandchildren, runs a foundation for wounded veterans. I have his number. He will want to know. Before Elias could respond, the doors at the back of the room burst open. A man in his early 30s stood in the doorway, breathing hard. He wore surgical scrubs beneath a hastily thrown jacket, and his face bore the unmistakable signs of interrupted work. But it was his eyes that drew attention, eyes that scanned the room with desperate intensity until they found what they were looking for, eyes that were the exact same shade of brown as Elias's. Damon Crane had his mother's cheekbones and his father's build. He was taller than Elias, broader in the shoulders, with the confident posture of a man who had made something of himself despite impossible odds. But in this moment, all of that confidence had been stripped away. In this moment, he was just a son looking for a father he had believed dead for over 2 decades. Dad, he said. The word came out broken, cracked in the middle like a bone that had never properly healed. Elias stepped forward. His legs felt unsteady, and his vision had begun to blur at the edges. Whether from the illness or the emotion, he could not tell. Perhaps both. Damon, he said. His voice was barely a whisper. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Damon crossed the room in 3 long strides. He did not hesitate. He did not ask questions. He simply wrapped his arms around the father he had spent 6 years searching for and held on as if letting go would mean losing him all over again. The room watched in silence as the 2 men clung to each other. Veterans wiped their eyes. Senator Holloway turned away to compose herself. Even Franklin Moss, the man who had started this confrontation with mockery and contempt, found himself blinking back tears. Dr. Weatherspoon moved closer, her medical training warring with her respect for the moment. Damon, she said softly, your father is very ill. He needs immediate medical attention. Damon pulled back just enough to look at his father's face. He saw what Dr. Weatherspoon had seen, the fever, the weight loss, the pallor beneath the weathered skin. His expression shifted, the sun giving way to the physician. How long, he asked. How long have you been sick? Elias shook his head. It does not matter. It matters to me. Damon's voice cracked again. I just got you back. I'm not losing you again. Elias reached up with a trembling hand and touched his son's face. The first time he had touched his child in over 6 years. The first time he had allowed himself to feel the warmth of family since the day he walked away. Whatever time I have left, he said quietly, I want to spend it with you. I want to meet your wife. I want to hold my grandchild. I want to be your father again, even if it is only for a little while. Damon's composure finally broke. Tears streamed down his face as he pulled his father close again. Then let's get you healthy, he said. Let me save you the way you saved all those others. And in that moment, surrounded by veterans whose lives he had touched and strangers whose hearts he had moved, Elias Crane finally allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved to be saved too. The embrace between father and son seemed to last an eternity and no time at all. When they finally separated, Damon kept one hand on his father's arm, as if physical contact was the only thing keeping this moment real. His physician's eyes were already cataloging symptoms, already running through differential diagnoses, already calculating how much time they might have. But before anyone could move toward the door, a commotion erupted at the back of the room. A man in his late 50s pushed through the crowd, his gait uneven, supported by a cane that bore the insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment. His hair had gone silver, and deep lines marked his face, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made people step aside without being asked. Curtis Delaney turned at the sound of the cane striking the floor. His face went pale. Tommy? Tommy Reardon had not waited for a phone call. Someone in the room had already texted him. Someone had sent him a photograph. And he had driven across the city at speeds that would have earned him a citation if any officer had tried to stop him. He stopped 10 feet from where Elias stood, his chest heaving from the exertion of moving faster than his damaged legs wanted to allow. For a long moment, he simply stared, his eyes tracing the scar that ran from temple to jaw, the weathered face, the posture that still held echoes of the soldier he had once been. "They told me you were dead," Tommy said. His voice shook with 30 years of suppressed emotion. "They told me the man who saved my life died in Afghanistan. I have spent 3 decades trying to honor a ghost." Elias met his eyes. "Tommy, you were 22 years old. You had a girl waiting for you back home. I was not going to let you die in that street." Tommy's cane clattered to the floor as he closed the distance between them. His arms wrapped around Elias with the desperate strength of a man embracing a miracle. The sound that came from his throat was not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, but something rawer than either. "You carried me," Tommy said into Elias's shoulder. 4 blocks, under fire. I could hear the bullets, and I could hear you breathing, and you never stopped. You never even slowed down. You told me to leave you," Elias said quietly. "You ordered me to save myself." Tommy pulled back, tears streaming freely down his face. "And you told me to shut up and hold on. You said you were taking me home." The room had gone absolutely silent. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to have dimmed, as if the building itself was bearing witness to this reunion. Senator Holloway stepped forward, her tablet in hand. "Mr. Reardon, I understand you run a foundation for wounded veterans." Tommy nodded, not taking his eyes off Elias. "The Shepherd Foundation. We named it after the man who saved my life. The man whose real name we never knew." He let out a broken laugh. "And he has been alive this whole time, living on the streets while we raised millions in his honor." The irony of it seemed to strike everyone at once. A foundation named after a legend, raising money to help veterans in need, while the legend himself slept in a tent by the river, too broken to ask for the help he had inspired. Frank Lamosse made a sound. It was small, barely audible, but in the silence of the room it drew every eye. He had sunk into his chair behind the administrator's table, his face buried in his hands. His shoulders were shaking. "I do not know," he said, the words muffled by his palms. "How could I have known? He looked like... I thought he was just another." "Just another what?" Curtis's voice cut like a blade. "Just another homeless veteran? Just another man down on his luck? Just another human being not worth your time or respect?" Moss looked up, and his face was a ruin of guilt and shame. "I have been doing this job for 15 years. 15 years of sorting through claims, trying to separate the real from the fake. I thought I was protecting the system. I thought I was doing the right thing." Senator Holloway's expression held no sympathy. "The right thing, Mr. Moss, would have been to treat every veteran who walked through those doors with dignity, regardless of what they looked like, regardless of what you assumed about them." She turned to her aide. "I want a full audit of every claim this office has denied in the past 5 years. Every single one." The other administrators at the table had gone pale. They had sat in silence throughout the entire confrontation, complicit in their cowardice, and now they would share in the consequences. Damon had been watching the exchange with growing fury. His hand tightened on his father's arm. "You mocked him," he said to Moss, his voice low and dangerous. "You publicly humiliated a man who has saved more lives than you can count. A man who has given more to this country than you could give in 100 lifetimes. Damon." Elias's voice was soft but firm. "That is enough." His son turned to him, confusion and anger warring on his face. "How can you defend him? After what he said to you?" "I'm not defending him." Elias looked at Moss with eyes that held no anger, only exhaustion and something that might have been pity. "But I have seen what happens when men let hatred consume them. I have seen good men become monsters because they could not let go of their rage. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. I did not come here for vengeance. I came here for recognition, not for myself, but for the men I carry with me. He touched his chest, where the names lay hidden beneath his shirt. Derek Huang, William Oduya, Antonio Vega, James Whitfield, Raymond Okonkwo. He spoke each name with the reverence of a prayer. These men deserve to be remembered. Their families deserve to know that their sacrifice mattered. That is why I came here today. That is the only reason. Tommy Reardon wiped his eyes. Then let us make sure they are remembered. The foundation has resources, connections. We can find their families. We can tell their stories. Senator Holloway nodded. And I will personally ensure that your service record is fully restored and declassified to the extent possible. The world should know what you did, Staff Sergeant Crane. She paused, correcting herself. The world should know what Shepard did. The use of the call sign rippled through the room. Veterans straightened unconsciously. Something had shifted in the air, something intangible but powerful. They were no longer witnessing a confrontation between a homeless man and a bureaucrat. They were witnessing the resurrection of a legend. Curtis Delaney was the first to move. He stepped back from Elias, his body straightening into a posture that decades of civilian life had not erased. His hand rose to his forehead in a crisp salute. One by one, the other veterans in the room followed suit. Old men and young men. Men in wheelchairs and men with prosthetic limbs. Men who had served in Vietnam and men who had served in Iraq. They rose to their feet if they could, straightened in their chairs if they could not, and rendered the salute that warriors reserve for their own. Elias stood frozen, overwhelmed by the gesture. Tears streamed down his weathered face, cutting tracks through the grime that 6 years on the streets had left behind. I do not deserve this, he whispered. Damon gripped his father's arm. You deserve this and more. And Tommy Reardon, the man whose life had been saved 30 years ago on a burning street in Mogadishu, spoke the words that every person in that room was thinking. Welcome home, Shepard. Welcome home. The salutes held for a long moment, a silent tribute from warriors to a warrior who had given everything and asked for nothing in return. When arms finally lowered, the room seemed to exhale as one. The tension that had gripped the space since Franklin Moss first opened his mouth had finally broken, replaced by something warmer, something that felt almost like grace. Damon moved first, his physician's instincts overriding everything else. Dad, we need to get you to the hospital. Now. Elias nodded slowly. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the confrontation was fading, and he could feel his body beginning to fail. His legs trembled beneath him. His vision had started to gray at the edges. The cough he had been suppressing threatened to break free. Dr. Weatherspoon appeared at his other side. I have already called ahead to Memorial. They are preparing a room. She looked at Damon with the professional respect of one medical practitioner to another. I assume you will want to oversee his care personally. I'm not leaving his side, Damon said. Not again. Not ever. Tommy Reardon retrieved his cane from where it had fallen. I'm coming too. Whatever he needs, whatever it costs, the Foundation will cover it. He looked at Elias with eyes still bright with tears. It is the least we can do for the man who gave us everything. Senator Holloway stepped forward, her phone already in hand. I will have security escort you to the hospital, and I will personally ensure that every piece of paperwork Mr. Crane needs is expedited through the system. She turned to her aide. I want his full benefits package restored by end of business today. Medical, disability, everything he is owed. Make it happen. The aide nodded and began typing furiously on his tablet. Across the room, Franklin Moss remained slumped in his chair. The other administrators had quietly gathered their belongings and slipped out through a side door, eager to distance themselves from the coming storm. But Moss could not move. The weight of what he had done, what he had almost done, pressed him into the seat like a physical force. Curtis Delaney approached the administrator's table, his footsteps heavy on the linoleum floor. He stopped directly in front of Moss and waited until the man raised his head. I want you to remember something, Curtis said, his voice low and controlled. Every veteran who walks through those doors has a story. Some of them are legends. Some of them are just ordinary men and women who answer their country's call. But every single one of them deserves to be treated with respect. Moss nodded weakly, unable to meet Curtis's eyes. You almost destroyed a hero today, Curtis continued. You almost sent him back to that tent by the river to die, alone and forgotten. And for what? Because he did not look the way you thought a hero should look? I was wrong, Moss whispered. I know I was wrong. Curtis leaned closer. Then do better. If you somehow keep your job after this, if they give you another chance, do better. Treat every veteran like they might be the next shepherd, because you never know who is standing in front of you. He turned and walked away without waiting for a response. Valerie Tran had lowered her phone at last. She had captured everything, from the initial confrontation to the final salute. The video was already uploading to her station servers, and she knew it would be on the national news by evening. But for now, she simply stood and watched as the group prepared to leave. Mr. Crane, she called out. Elias turned to look at her, supported on either side by his son and Dr. Weatherspoon. Would you be willing to share your story? Not now, but when you're feeling better. The world should know what happened here today. Elias considered the question for a long moment. My story is not special, he said finally. There are thousands of veterans like me, living on the streets, forgotten by the system, carrying wounds that no one can see. That is exactly why we need to tell it, Valerie said softly. Elias looked at Damon, then at Tommy, then at the room full of veterans who had witnessed his resurrection. If telling my story helps even one of them, he said, then yes, I will tell it. The group began to move toward the door. Veterans stepped aside to let them pass, many reaching out to touch Elias's arm or shoulder as he went by. Small gestures of connection, acknowledgments from those who understood what he had carried. At the doorway, Elias paused and turned back to look at the room one last time. His eyes found the American flag hanging limp in the corner, the POW/MIA flag beside it. He straightened his spine despite the pain it caused and raised his hand in a final salute. For Raymond, he said quietly. For Derek and William and Antonio and James. For every name I carry, I'm still here. I'm still trying. His hand lowered, and he allowed Damon to guide him through the door. The drive to the hospital was a blur of motion and murmured reassurances. Damon sat beside his father in the back of Senator Holloway's town car, one hand pressed against Elias's wrist to monitor his pulse. Dr. Weatherspoon sat on the other side, her medical bag open, ready to intervene if necessary. Tell me about her, Elias said suddenly. His voice was weak, but there was an urgency beneath the exhaustion. Your wife. My granddaughter. Tell me everything. Damon's composure cracked again. Her name is Sarah. She's a pediatric nurse. We met during my residency. He paused, gathering himself. And your granddaughter is named Nadine. After Mom. Elias closed his eyes, and tears slipped down his weathered cheeks. Nadine. She is 3 years old, Damon continued. She has your eyes, and she asked about her grandfather all the time. We showed her pictures. We told her stories. We never let her forget that you existed, even when we did not know if you were still alive. Elias's hand found his son's and gripped it with surprising strength. I want to meet her. I want to hold her. I want to tell her about her grandmother. You will, Damon promised. His voice broke on the words. You will. The hospital came into view through the car windows, its emergency entrance lit up against the gathering dusk. A team was already waiting outside, alerted by Dr. Weatherspoon's call. They moved with the efficient urgency of professionals who understood that every second mattered. As the car pulled to a stop, Elias looked at his son with eyes that held something they had not held in years. Peace. I stopped running, he said. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that. I finally stopped running. Damon helped his father out of the car and into the waiting wheelchair. Medical personnel surrounded them immediately, but Damon never let go of his father's hand. Welcome home, Dad, he said. Welcome home. 3 months had passed since the day Elias Crane walked into a VA town hall meeting and walked out a legend reborn. The diagnosis had been severe, but not hopeless. Stage 3 lung cancer, the result of years of exposure to burn pits and chemical agents in theaters of war that the government was only now beginning to acknowledge. Damon had assembled a team of the best oncologists in the country, and Tommy Riordan's foundation had covered every expense without question. The treatment was aggressive, the side effects brutal, but Elias faced it with the same quiet determination that had carried him through jungles and deserts and burning cities. He was sitting in a garden now, the small courtyard behind Damon's house where Sarah had planted roses that reminded her of her grandmother's home. The afternoon sun warmed his face, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Elias felt something close to peace. "Grandpa." The voice was small and bright, carrying the particular music of childhood wonder. Elias turned to see a 3-year-old girl with dark curls and eyes that were indeed the same shade of brown as his own. She was carrying a book, clutching it against her chest with the serious expression of someone entrusted with an important mission. "Nadine." Elias's voice had grown stronger over the past months, fed by proper nutrition and medical care and the simple miracle of being loved. "What do you have there?" The little girl climbed into his lap with the fearless confidence of a child who had never known rejection. "It is the Star Book," she announced. "Daddy said you used to read it to him when he was little." Elias looked at the worn cover and felt his throat tighten. It was the astronomy book he had carried through 3 wars, the one his own father had given him before his first deployment. He had left it behind when he walked away from his family, unable to carry one more reminder of everything he had lost. "Your daddy kept it," he said softly. "All these years. He said you would come back for it someday." Nadine opened the book to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "He said you always came back." Elias held his granddaughter close and began to read, his voice carrying across the garden where Damon and Sarah watched from the kitchen window. The words were familiar, unchanged by the decades that had passed since he first learned them. But they meant something different now. They meant hope instead of escape. They meant future instead of past. The video from the VA town hall had gone viral within hours of Valerie Tran uploading it. Within days, it had been viewed over 50 million times. The story of Shepard, the legendary medic who had been living homeless on American streets while the country he served forgot he existed, had sparked a national conversation about veteran care that showed no signs of fading. Frank Lamas had resigned before the investigation could formally begin. Senator Holloway's audit had revealed systemic failures across the regional VA system, patterns of dismissal and neglect that had affected hundreds of veterans beyond Elias. Reforms were already being implemented, and other regions were conducting their own reviews. The change would not happen overnight, but it had begun. The Shepard Foundation had seen donations triple in the weeks following the revelation. Tommy Riordan had used the funds to expand their programs, opening new facilities in 3 cities and hiring additional staff to handle the influx of veterans seeking help. But the most significant addition to the foundation was not a building or a budget line. It was Elias himself. 3 days a week, when his health allowed, Elias visited the foundation's main facility. He sat with veterans who reminded him of himself, men and women who had fallen through every crack the system had to offer. He did not offer advice or platitudes. He simply listened. He shared his own story when it seemed like it might help. And he reminded them, again and again, that asking for help was not weakness. It was the bravest thing a soldier could do. The families of the fallen had been found. Derek Huang's mother, now in her 80s, had wept when Elias called to tell her that her son's name was tattooed over his heart. William Odia's sister had flown from Chicago to meet the man who had held her brother's hand as he died. Antonio Vega's children, now adults with families of their own, had attended a memorial service where Elias spoke their father's name aloud and told them he had died a hero. James Whitfield's father was the hardest call. The old man had never recovered from losing his son, had spent 30 years wondering if he could have done something differently, said something that would have kept James home instead of sending him to war. Elias had driven to his home in rural Pennsylvania and sat with him for 6 hours, sharing memories of the son who had talked about fishing trips in his final moments. "He loved you," Elias had told the grieving father. "The last thing he talked about was the trip you were going to take together. He was happy right up until the end. He was thinking of you." Raymond's pouch sat on Elias's bedside table now, finally opened after 40 years. Inside, he had found a photograph and a message his mentor had left for him. But he had also found something else. A letter, written in Raymond's careful hand, addressed to whoever might find it. If you are reading this, it means I did not make it home. But if Shepard is still carrying this pouch, it means the gift lives on. Take care of him. He will not ask for help. He will not believe he deserves it. But he does. He saved more lives than he will ever know. Make sure he knows that his life was worth saving too. Elias had read the letter 100 times since finding it. Each time, he heard Raymond's voice speaking the words. Each time, he felt the weight of his mentor's faith pressing against his chest like a medal he had finally earned. The sun was setting now, painting the garden in shades of gold and amber. Nadine had fallen asleep in his lap, the astronomy book still open to a page about constellations. Damon appeared in the doorway, a cup of tea in his hands and a smile on his face that still made Elias's heart ache with gratitude. "She loves those stories," Damon said, settling into the chair beside his father. "She asks for them every night." "I used to read them to you," Elias said, "when you were small, before everything fell apart. I remember." Damon's hand found his father's and held it gently. "I never stopped remembering." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear, the same stars that had watched over Elias through every deployment, every loss, every long night of wondering if he would survive to see another dawn. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible even when hope seems lost, please subscribe to our channel and share in the comments. Who is the quiet hero in your life who deserves recognition? Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones in uniform. Sometimes they are the ones who simply refuse to stop trying. Thank you for watching. Elias looked up at the emerging constellations and felt Raymond's presence beside him, felt Nadine's warmth against his chest, felt his son's hand anchoring him to a world he had almost abandoned. "Still here, Raymond," he whispered, "still trying. And this time, I'm not trying alone." The night settled over the garden like a blessing, and Elias Crane, call sign Shepard, finally allowed himself to rest. Not the restless sleep of a man running from his past, but the deep peace of a man who had found his way home. He had been lost for so long, but he had been found. And in the finding, he had discovered something he thought he had lost forever in those mountains 20 years ago. The will to live, not just to survive, not just to endure, but to truly, fully, gratefully live. And that, in the end, was the greatest gift of all.